All right. Hello, hello, and thanks for joining us. So we just sent out a poll. Feel free to respond to the poll. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. We also sent out this poll on Twitter, so we got some really cool responses there. Today, we will be getting into the wild world of CI/CD secrets. So every month, we cover a fresh new topic of CI/CD related content. So make sure to keep an eye on our future sessions as well. Today's session is interactive, so please feel free to submit any questions that you have, and we're going to do our best to answer them live or follow up after with an answer. Today is actually a first where we're bringing some internal DevOps experts to share some of their hard earned experience with CI/CD secrets. So, CodeFresh, we've maintained many different steps and native integrations with secrets platforms. We have our own shared configuration and secrets built in, as well as maintaining many, SaaS platforms and secrets as part of those. So, we have a lot of experience internally with this. So, we wanted to bring some of that knowledge here as well. So we have two guests today. Dan Garfield is joining us today on very little sleep after his speaking quadrilogy of ArgoCon, KubeCon, Build and Deploy, and GitOpsCon. He actually just landed back home about 2 a.m. this morning, I think, from the Open Source Summit. So we're going to do our best to keep him awake today. So Dan, give us a brief intro about yourself and what makes you a secrets expert.
Yeah, so I'm Dan Garfield. Many of you know me. I'm the co-founder of CodeFresh. I'm chief open source officer. I'm an Argo maintainer. I helped create the Open GitOps standard and create that working group, and worked on doing ArgoCon and GitOpsCon and all that stuff. And when it comes to secrets, I don't know that I necessarily think of myself as an expert on secrets. I just think of myself as having to deal with them often. And so it's more about where secrets fit into the system. And so I think that, the time that we've spent helping people adopt GitOps, helping people do CI/CD, there's just something you got to deal with. And so I guess I've dealt with them a number of times.
Yeah, I think beyond that too, like you've done a bunch of talks about secure supply chains and secrets as part of that process. So
That's
I
a very
think
good point.
that
Yes.
yeah, I mean, some of our implementations have leaned into that, but there's been a lot of talks that I mean, it's just a topic like that you said that every company encounters, right? So thank you for joining us today, Dan. I know you're tired, but thanks for coming in. And then also up next is Yoni Karin, who is a passionate DevOps engineer. He's got a strong SRE focus at CodeFresh. He's maintaining our production Kubernetes environments, our secrets, and all the fun magic that's happening behind the scenes. So he's joining us all the way from Israel. So thanks for joining us at such a late hour. So Yoni, why don't you give us a quick rundown about yourself and what makes you a secret expert?
Hey everybody. My name is Yoni. I've been working at CodeFresh for over a year now. Before that, I was working at Cloud Posse, a DevOps accelerator with lots of Terraform modules that some of you may or may have not have seen. And before that, I've worked at as a DevOps consultant, and I've worked at numerous startups. And I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a secrets expert, but because I've worked both as an internal DevOps engineer in a more mature startup, CodeFresh, namely 8 years. I've not worked here 8 years, but it's a startup that's 8 years old. I've also worked at startups that are 8 months old. And I've also worked the accelerator for greenfield projects where everything has less pressure and you can do everything right. And also as a consultant, I've really seen a lot of good practices and bad practices. So I think I wouldn't call myself a DevOps expert, but I would definitely consider myself passionate about secrets because I've seen people do it right and I've seen people do it not right.
Yeah, it was kind of a trick question to be honest, because to say you're an expert in anything related to DevOps or CI/CD or Kubernetes is a bit of a trap. But thank you for joining us, Yoni. This should be a really fun discussion.
Yeah, there
So
was there was a
yeah,
KubeCon talk, a GitOpsCon talk last year that was called "1,000 Different Ways to Do Secrets," and I thought, I'm not an expert. I can only think of 900. You know?
yeah, exactly. So let's just jump straight in. So I'm gonna start with the hard or easy question. I'm not sure which, but are CI/CD pipeline secrets a solved problem at this point? I guess the question is, what's mostly solved at this point? Like, you want to take us away, Yoni, and your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of the CD and syncing secrets to an environment, we had a poll in the beginning of this webinar for what's your favorite Kubernetes secrets operator. That's very much a solved problem at this point. You can securely store secrets in AWS Secrets Manager. You can encrypt them in SOPs and use SOPs secrets operator to sync them using Argo, for example. So the mechanism of syncing secrets to an environment is solved. I think everybody who's using their CI tool, Jenkins, CodeFresh, GitHub Actions, it's fairly straightforward how to store static secrets and use them in a pipeline, but rotating them, for example, is not so simple. So the things that are not just mechanisms, but are actual procedures in your organization and affect your environments and also rely on people doing things correctly. Those are generally more difficult and are not necessarily solved problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Yeah, go
think
ahead, Dan.
I think of that question like, are they solved where? Are they solved in your organization? Are they solved in your Git repo? Are they solved in your CI/CD pipeline? Like, I think your Yoni is dead on correct that there are a lot of great solutions out there. Whether or not people are taking advantage of them is a big question. So there are the tools to solve it, but they're still a big problem in a lot of organizations, and people still struggle with them. I mean, we still see people checking those secrets in to Git, throwing them on their deployments. And then just even a misunderstanding of like what level of secrets are secure and how much security they're offering. How secure are Kubernetes secrets? Like, it's base 64 encoded. It's not encrypted. Like,
Yeah.
it's not protected in that way. You got to rely on RBAC to really protect those things. So there's varying levels for sure. And even within CI/CD, there are a lot of nuances in how you manage them. So I actually would challenge those that think they do have it solved. Maybe during this cast, they might find out that maybe they don't have it solved.
Or they're lucky. I think some organizations just have a better emphasis on secrets, and it really depends on culture, the pressure on how fast you guys are trying to go in your startup. And I think what I've seen a lot, for example, is with secrets in general, and this I think bleeds into the territory of general cloud best practices. I've seen a shotgun approach to permissions. So the quality of the secret itself. Hopefully, people are not relying on static IAM credentials, for example. Hopefully, they've moved over to service account roles, and a lot of CI tools now offer OIDC for authenticating to AWS, for example. I'm sure the Azure and GCP have something very similar. So just not having to deal with static secrets is definitely something that it hopefully, even if now everybody's on the same page, you might be dealing with some legacy secrets from 4 years ago that are still not rotated. You can see over 1,000 days not rotated. And even if you do have IRSA roles, you do have authentication using OIDC, you might have this shotgun approach to permissions where somebody's like, well, I don't know which permissions this actually needs. I'm just going to give it admin and not worry about it. Maybe we'll fix it later. And then it never gets fixed. So that's definitely a cultural problem. And I think it affects startups more than anything.
Well, on that, like with Helm, we've moved to a tillerless Helm, thankfully, as a community. Like, there used to be, for those that don't remember, for the grandpa days, like we used to have Tiller, which was a server-side component running in Helm. And in order to get it running, if you were on the website in the documentation, it was like, how do you get it running? And it was like, run this command. And it's like, what does this command do? Well, it gives full admin permissions to Tiller to do whatever the heck it wants, anywhere, forever. And there are actually a lot of tools that do that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
And the documentation is geared towards get this up and running so you can start using it as quickly as possible, though it may not actually be the kind of fine-grained approach. I mean, it's a shotgun approach. It's like, it's going to work for everything, whether you wanted it to or not.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the challenges too. And you guys were talking about sort of the difference between standing up something and for operationally speaking, standing it up and actually maintaining something, especially once we're talking about like production readiness, right? And I think I've seen that the one token to rule them all way more times than I would like to admit that just sticks around to Yoni's point
Mhm.
and just doesn't go away. And that's obviously concerning, but you were kind of touching on culture as well. And some of that is because maybe some companies haven't actually steeped that culture of we should audit this process. Like we should regularly audit and check these things. And you kept talking about
Yeah,
rotation. Well, rotation also is kind of something that has to be done at a cultural level, right? There has to be that
yeah. I
expectation that it
think
has to be built into the process. The time has to be there to invest in that.
you mentioned auditing, and nobody wants to be audited, right? So
Yeah.
if a startup is just getting off the ground and hasn't passed all their SOC compliance and PCI PSS compliance for the first time, and usually with these things, the first audit is the heaviest, where everybody's like scrambling. Wow, we need to redo everything. This is wrong. This is wrong. It's only when you have that sweeping change from the very top, your VP R&D or your CTO, that people are okay. Well, I'm going to stop writing features and actually worry about these things and change. Like the development teams are now going to focus on changing the process rather than continuing into the next sprint with all their features. So that's the only time really that people have this focus. And I've also did some consulting with a subsidiary once in a Fortune 500 company, and I was really impressed with the size of the security team. Really, really smart people. Even in an organization where the security team is just amazing, you still have this. Well, I am waiting for them to approve this role that I need to create and whatever.
Yeah.
But in those organizations, the culture for doing things correctly and secrets is really, really strong. So that's where you will see less those one token to rule them all. And you're going to have requirements like, well, this secret cannot exist for more than 90 days. And then you're actually thinking about how to rotate it. And maybe it's because it's difficult, or maybe it's because that fewer companies actually get to this point. Fewer startups that actually succeed, get off the ground, pass all these security compliance audits, and grow a security team, like grow a number and have a security team actually get to this point. So it's maybe it's just less people have to deal with it, and it's also less. It's also more difficult that it's less of a solved problem.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, just to kind of jump on that as well. And I think, at large enterprises, there is often the pain point of that interaction between the security team, the DevOps team, and the developer team. And it's always about finding that pragmatic balance of how much can they really apply that enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
from just like layering it over the top or trying to bake it into the process so that developers have some understanding of it. And I feel like that's an area
Mm-hmm.
that I see companies of all sizes struggle with, and it's just tricky to know. And that kind of comes back to, how much uh, gets layered into, say, the secrets management solution versus how much is manually managed by like rotation processes that DevOps teams build or developers build
Mm-hmm.
versus the security team actually establishing those practices. And I think some of that's only going to scale with the size of the company, right?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned enterprises, and it's interesting because this is also something I wanted to get to. The larger organizations can suddenly afford all of the enterprise tools like CyberArk and Vault. And the one I'm more familiar with is Vault. I used to work in a company that was a HashiCorp partner. And without doing like a product pitch that I learned from a few years ago, I will say that their product is built around. First of all, it's you're paying for what you're getting out of it, and it really is those enterprise, medium to large size businesses that can really afford this kind of stuff. But it's really built from the perspective of we don't want a single person in an organization having to manage all these rotations and assign roles and stuff. You can programmatically create roles. You can programmatically create these set up these providers that allow you to have dynamic secrets. And the idea is you have this centralized appliance in your organization that really makes these things easier. So you don't have to figure it out for yourself. That being said, it's also a lot of energy to keep these things running. It's expensive, as I mentioned before, and they even have training for these types of things. So the bigger enterprises have the luxury of first having a security team to be able to work with this type of stuff, the money for these appliances, and also these products are built for they have training sessions um, for the people that are buying the product, where they really think about the cultural aspects and the procedures in the organization, rotation, for example.
It
Yeah,
is
definitely.
it is really nice for your developers to not have to worry about it. I mean, if you've got a good, I mean, I don't know, HashiCorp Vault is a great example where it's automatically being rotated and like keys are just handled in sort of this passive way from the developer perspective. It's just passed through. They don't have to think about it. That's really valuable and it saves so much overhead from them. I was at GitOpsCon yesterday, as you mentioned, and I was talking with the head of operations and engineering for a company that you all know and have used and are familiar with. And I won't out them just in case they don't want this detail out. But they told me that they've been hiring a lot of Zoomers. You know, they say they do a lot of recruiting off of TikTok. They find people who are talking about engineering off of TikTok and recruit them, which is an interesting strategy. But they're not used to they're so cloud native, they're used to just using the cloud that they don't have the mindset. This is within their organization. This isn't a slur on all Zoomers or anything. This is just what they said in their organization. They don't have the mindset of the difference between dev, staging, prod. They're like, I deployed it. It exists. It has a public endpoint. Prod, that's what prod is now. And so in that kind of organization, that kind of culture, that's really valuable from an innovation standpoint. And if you have the secrets kind of baked in and figured out for people, so it's just like they know how it works and how it's going to be passed through and they're going to be auto rotated and all this stuff, then that's great. But if you don't have that, then everybody ends up doing stuff kind of their own way, and you end up with all these different configurations out there, and some of them, have problems, or you've got stuff that should be secret that isn't.
Oh yeah.
Like public S3 buckets at the CIA and whatnot.
Yeah, definitely. And I think
Yeah,
we
and
we
you might
talked a
think
little.
that.
Yeah, go ahead, Yoni.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that Dan's point, and you might think that with that siloing that happens in the organization, that it's not that big of a deal. Production always has its eyes on it, but if you look at the Uber hack, if I'm not mistaken, that happened on a dev account. It started from that,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we kind of discussed a little bit about this, Dan, and maybe we'll touch in it a bit. But actually, I think the poll results came in. So let's take a look at the poll results and see what that came in. I'm curious to see what people focused on. So yeah, for the favorite Kubernetes secret operator, so Vault taking the lead here, a very strong lead at 50%. External secrets at 19%, sealed secrets at 9%, SOP secrets at 13%, and then nothing really that they specifically specified. Hopefully, not committing plain text secrets into Git. What do you guys
Yeah,
think of
that
those
one was me.
results?
That was definitely me.
Yeah, what do you guys think of these results? Does that align with what you would expect from this, or?
I'm interested to know if the Vault one, if I'm not mistaken, it was in April that HashiCorp released a Vault secrets operator. Like they've had a secrets injector for a while now, but then there's a new operator they released. I might be mistaken, but it was only a couple months ago. So I'm interested to know if people are really referring to that particular operator, which is relatively new, or just Vault in general in the context of Kubernetes.
Probably just
Yeah,
Vault General, I think.
yeah, I would think so. Yeah, more in general, because I mean, Vault, it covers so many different use cases at this point. But that's really interesting. I think, from ah from our perspective, the it doesn't really make a difference, right? So I mean, our goal is to integrate with a bunch of different stuff, and I think use the right tool for the job. And I think Vault is a great tool for the job. So to see that be up here at 50% makes a lot of sense to me. Now, obviously, the utilization of it can be a little bit different, but depending on how you implement it, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at, Yoni. But Vault itself
Mhm.
is very strong store for your secrets.
I do wonder how much maybe overlap and confusion there is here with operational secrets, what they're doing in their Kubernetes cluster versus their CI/CD. I mean, I don't know what everybody's using for their CI/CD, if they're using CodeFresh or GitHub Actions or Jenkins or whatever, but there's definitely a varying, there's kind of there's definitely a blurred line, because when you're doing CI/CD, you're trying to get stuff operating into production, and you may need to handle secrets as part of your automation flow. But also you have secrets that you're managing for like pushing to your artifact registry, or potentially connecting to an Argo instance, or making Git commits, or all kinds of other scenarios. And the problem set is actually a little bit different than operating secrets, secrets running in your Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah. And I think
There's a big nuance to that. Oh,
yeah, exactly.
sorry.
I think we were always going to bleed in from environment variables and secrets into operational variables and secrets, right?
Yeah.
What do you think, Yoni?
One thing that's interesting though is, and we've said this again and again with blog posts about this, and we're not the only ones. Weaveworks was saying this for a long time as well, is do not do push-based, the kubectl applies, Helm upgrade in your CI pipelines. That is not GitOps. And if you actually are thinking who's doing push-based deploys versus pull-based deploys with Flux or with Argo, that really changes the secrets that you're going to have in your CI. So if you're doing push-based stuff, you're going to have kube configs and things like that in your CI suddenly. So that's a huge factor as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, you know what, let's drill in a little bit deeper. So, we're fortunate to work with a lot of different customers and a lot of different use cases. How are you seeing teams managing secrets as part of the build and deployment process? And I guess the additional follow-up is, Yoni, you're hoping to manage some of our stuff internally. How are we doing it? And, what are we seeing out there right now in the space?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'll start with a little bit of a follow-up to what I just added, because it's right on top of my head. But I mentioned that we're using pull-based deployments. So I'll talk more of our CD a part of the equation. But we're using Argo to sync our manifests, and we're actually using it as well to sync our secrets. And we are, without giving too much detail, we've had to weigh out some options, and we're moving towards newer ways of doing things. So we're actually moving towards ESO more and more, but we do have legacy stuff in our system. What we used to do is we used to have the Helm secrets plugin, and we used to have that installed on our Argo instances, and we would be able to take a values file for a Helm release, for example, and use Mozilla SOPs to encrypt the keys. And that was something we've moved away from for several reasons. One valid reason and one not so valid reason. And I don't know if I should be sharing the not so valid reason, but it's kind of funny. Is a long time ago, somebody created a script that would encrypt everything, decrypt everything, and then you would see the entire decrypted file. You can edit the values, and then it would re-encrypt everything. And people are like, well, I'm not happy with the commit diff because everything's changed. I don't know what changed. And it was because this person who worked here a very long time ago didn't read the docs and see that, oh, well, you can actually just do SOPs file name and it opens up Vim. And if you change it, it'll only change that. It won't decrypt and recrypt everything. And then your diff says, it won't tell you what the value is, but it'll tell you that one particular key in the YAML has changed. And people who are new to SOPs might think, well, I don't really want to version my secrets at all. That's crazy. But it is encrypted with, you can use KMS keys. It also works with Azure Key Vault, for example. I'm not sure if that's equivalent to KMS. I might be wrong. But you have a very secure way of actually versioning those secrets, and I like it. The valid reason that is a downside is if that key is gone, then your source of truth in Git is absolutely useless because you can't decrypt it. So we're actually going towards a mix of both worlds, where we are using secrets in AWS Secrets Manager, and then we're using external secrets operator to sync them to our Kubernetes clusters, and they end up being as secrets. And we want to, I said, best of both worlds. We want to use SOPs as a source of truth for those ASM secrets, so that you do have GitOps in this scenario. You're not just deploying secrets manually into your cloud. So that is what we're doing. And the nice thing now is ESO is not the only option. There's Dan, give me the name is so, it always confuses me. The CSI secrets operator, the new
CSI
one,
secret
the
driver.
driver. Okay, right. So now it even supports Vault, it supports ASM, supports Azure, AWS, it supports Azure. So ESO is not the only option. And there's another one that is worth mentioning. Instead, if somebody doesn't care about using the secrets in AWS Secrets Manager, for example, and just wants to use straight up SOPs, there's a really interesting one that I really like. My personal favorite is it just has a soft spot in my heart. It's not necessarily because of the reason why I mentioned with the putting all of your eggs into one basket with the KMS key. It might not be the best thing, but the SOP secrets operator actually has a CRD resource that within the spec, it gets encrypted, right? So the way SOPs will encrypt it, you have to supply a flag to give it the correct path.
Yeah.
But the way the CRD gets encrypted is you have this resource in Kubernetes, and within the spec, you have the encrypted YAML with the SOPs metadata, and then you just give the secret operator an IRSA role that has access to KMS, and it'll be able to decrypt it and add those secrets. So there's so many options. Like I said, that's a very straightforward problem, how to sync them. But that's what we're doing right now with the CD part is ESO.
Yeah, thanks for sharing about that. And I think that's great perspective on, one way to kind of solve this solution, right? But to your point, it's one of many, many, many different paths that you can go down. So Dan, what are you seeing in the wider space? From you talk to a ton of customers, you talk to a ton of people in the space. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so on the CI/CD side, we see people integrating with an external secrets provider. CodeFresh has built-in secrets, or they'll plug in an extra, store. And most often, I see people manually creating secrets, storing them statically, and then referencing them. And that's secure, but they need to be rotated, and you probably forget to rotate them. And even if you are in a mind to rotate them, you have to have a system to do that. So like, for example, this isn't necessarily about secrets, but like K3s, Kubernetes, I've got my home lab back here. My cluster went down one day because all my certificates became invalid. Well, they became invalid. They're set up to auto rotate every time a node reboots. I didn't rebuild any nodes for a year, so they all expired. So even though auto rotation was set up, there actually wasn't a mechanism to trigger it. And auto rotation is like, if you think about it as levels with CI/CD, it's like level 0, I'm just writing the secret in plain text, and it's bad, and it shows up in my logs.
Yeah.
And level 2 is I'm doing that, but I'm obscuring it from my logs. And level 3, I mean, these are all basically level 0. But the next level is like, okay, I've got a static encrypted secret that I'm referencing, and it's obscured from logs. And then you go up to dynamically provisioning. And so this is where OIDC comes in, where for those of you that aren't familiar with OIDC, it's OpenID Connect, I think is what it stands for. OpenID Connect, OIDC. Yeah. And basically what you can do is you can basically generate identity tokens that are one-offs. And that's super powerful because you don't care if you lose your identity token because it's just for that workload. So you don't actually need to rotate secrets. So it's sort of like the Matrix, like you're telling me when I'm ready, I won't even need to rotate secrets, or I can automatically rotate them. No, I'm telling you, you won't even need to rotate them because they're just automatically created as one-offs. So that gamut of maturity depends a little bit on the use cases and how critical these different components are and how they view them. And, depending on the kinds of actors you're dealing with. So, we work with people who have threat models from state sponsored, agencies. That's going to have a different threat model than somebody who's maybe just worried about ransomware or something like that. But for the people, going over even to the sealed secrets side or external secrets, or anytime you have secrets that are stored in an encrypted but less private way, so like maybe you're checking it into Git, there's a lot of unease still from people. They don't feel good about that because we've drilled into people's heads, you don't check secrets into Git, you don't check them in, you don't do it. Well, really, it's you don't check in plain text stuff, because public key encryption, spoiler alert, it's really good. Like we couldn't use the internet if it didn't work. You couldn't connect securely to Gmail and read your email if public key encryption was insecure in that way. So there are keys published publicly all over the place, and it's proves the value of encryption. I mean, crypto is another example where it's like, yeah, encryption exists, so you can't take a wallet and get the decryption key. You need all the computing, you need all the resources in the universe to and have enough energy to run the computing until the end of time for you to break the key. It's just not feasible. And so yeah, I think we definitely see a huge variety in the maturity level that people are at. And again, not necessarily maturity, but depending on the use case. And definitely still some hesitancy on some of these solutions that are more Git oriented, even though GitOps doesn't require you to check your secrets into Git. That's nowhere in the spec. We made sure that wasn't in the spec because we knew that secrets needed to be manageable in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. But it does go back to something Yoni was saying earlier, which is single source of truth is a real problem that exists in many areas of computer science, right? But it's particularly troublesome in secrets, because you are often maintaining it for multiple environments, maybe even multiple regions, many applications. It gets out of hand pretty quickly. So, like, yes, I totally agree with you. People are still kind of sticking that mindset, like, Git secrets, can be dangerous, right? And I think we've seen many leaks. Like, I think you were talking about one that happened, with Travis CI, where they were
Oh
echoing out
yeah.
secrets in the logs.
Yeah, so this is actually a whole class of vulnerabilities that we're very keen on. CodeFresh being a CI provider, we're very aware of this because this is the most common way that people attack to get secrets out of the supply chain. Is you find a way to open a malicious pull request, and that malicious pull request consumes secrets that exist on a pipeline and outputs them in some way or uploads them in some way. And so Travis CI had a lot of trouble with this, especially a few years ago. And it's not limited to Travis CI, but it was just because it was commonly used on open source builds. So it's still a potential issue with GitHub Actions, depending on how you configure stuff. If you're not careful and you're allowing people to modify pipelines in pull requests, then that's a potential issue that you have. So you need to make sure that your source of truth for the pipeline doesn't allow modification externally, because that basically is allowing injection. But even if it wasn't injected, it still has to build code. It still has to build the code that you're submitting. And so, for example, one of the things we did in CodeFresh early on was we just made it so that anytime a secret is mentioned, it's just automatically obfuscated from the logs. And that's kind of like that, that old IRC joke where you're chatting and you're like, hey, did you notice that it censors your password, and you type a bunch of stars and you
Oh,
send,
yeah.
and they're like, wow, it does. Let me try. Then they type their password and you're like, I can't see it. And they're like, I can see it. And everybody's like, well, yeah, that's because it's your password, But with CI/CD, like really actually obfuscating it, really actually removing it, that's actually a pretty important step to even have, just because it prevents security is about layers, right?
Yeah.
So, you shouldn't be echoing out secrets anyway, but what if you at least have a mechanism to catch it, and you can flag it and deal with it at that point? But um, again, these issues are greatly reduced if you're using something like one-off tokens, right? Because
Right.
as much.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back, and this is really open to either of you guys, but we've kind of circled around the wagons a lot here talking about role-based authentication, right? To grab secrets and stuff like that. Do you feel like that has made a lot of this simpler, or I guess following maybe what would be considered a best practice simpler, or has it made it more complicated?
I think it's usually more
I,
complicated.
I think
Like,
if I look back
go ahead.
a few years ago, it was definitely more the era of static secrets. For example, with the OIDC stuff in CI, a few years ago, you would have had to take your AWS static credentials and put that into GitHub Actions or GitLab or whatever. Now with OIDC or CodeFresh, and now that you have a OIDC, you don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. But so that's a lot of that stuff has magically disappeared from, at least from my view. But of course, people deal with legacy environments and legacy pipelines, and they might still be dealing with these things. And it all comes down to the technology might be there, but as I mentioned before, it was a really funny and cute little fail with SOPs. But what you were talking about with the forks, people leveraging forks depending on the CI tool and extracting secrets. I think that, for example, for GitHub Actions, it's solved at this point, but they still warn, for example, never use your self-hosted runners in public repositories. Somebody can gain access to it, extract the token, and delete all your repos, for example. So the key is always somebody has to do the research in the organization. Somebody has to do the homework and do things correctly with the event, like the open source tool or the vendor if they're using an actual SaaS for the CI, for example.
Yeah.
So it's easier, but it's not like a walk in the park.
Well, what you were saying about OIDC, I was just thinking, like, I agree this is kind of the best case scenario and very powerful, but admittedly, I probably see it in less than 5% of users' stuff.
Wow.
So it exists, you can use it. Most people aren't there yet. And so to your question, Brandon, of has it gotten easier? I mean, I think Yoni's right. It's gotten easier to be more secure, but it
Yeah.
hasn't necessarily gotten easier to completely solve the problem. So like
Right.
it's sort of like everybody has a budget of, like, let's say 1% of their time that they're willing to put towards secrets. The amount they can get done with that 1% today is definitely a lot more than what it was 5 years ago. But it still may not actually be enough to get them to fully take advantage of all the tooling that's available to
Right.
make it, completely bulletproof.
Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that I would kind of mirror as well, just from, getting to experience a lot of different environments, as I feel like it's that budget portion that you talked about, but it's also adding additional operational complexity that they may not be comfortable with, right? Whether it's a knowledge gap or they have a process and it's been working for them. And the other part is going back to what Yoni said, you have teams that are dealing with legacy applications that have an existing process that seems to work for them. And when they're building new applications, they don't want to change that as well. So there's some carryover. So it's really interesting because I feel like the tools around this stuff, especially if we had this discussion 2 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about like the secret in the same way that we already have, right? Like they weren't at the place that they're at today. So it is really getting good. But when does it become pragmatic for organizations to adopt that and implement it? And I think that's a trickier scenario. I know Yoni, you're going to
There is
say
a trump card. There is a
now.
trump card now. Where with ChatGPT is going to write all of your Jenkins Groovy pipelines, your GitHub Actions workflows, and your CodeFresh pipelines, and it's going to do everything right. And you're not going to have. But no, I'm half joking. But but maybe that's actually going to change at least the budget that Dan was talking about a little bit and give people some breathing room to do things that are higher quality, including secrets management. But at the end of the day, there's high quality human decisions that need to be made, like how are we going to pass this this audit? How are we going to achieve PCI DSS compliance and implement? There's no static credentials in our organizations at all. It is probably not going to go away. And 2 years from now, we're going to have this ChatGPT, this being like a normal fact of life, and some other things that have made rotation maybe a lot easier for in the cloud context, for example. Who knows?
Yeah, for sure. So we actually got a great question from Christian that came in, and he was wondering, how much system time or let's say people resources are typically going into managing these secrets, between leaks, rotating them, escalations, like, then you talk about compliance reporting for audits. Like, what are we seeing out there? What, like, if you had to throw an estimate on it, our team spending 10% of their time on this, 15% of their time, 20% of the time. Dan had kind of thrown out 1%, which is sometimes how I feel about security, but not everyone feels the same. So
about
I think
specifically.
yeah.
a good question to ask on top of that is not only how much time is being spent, but who is spending that time. And I will tell you from my experience, a lot of organizations are like, team DevOps, it's your job. It's not my job. I don't care. Do it. Give me the secret. Do a rotation. I'm not working with that. So it depends. It's just, and that's the problem of silos, right? Which we've also alluded to before. And you might also have a siloed organization with DevOps being another silo, and it might even be undersized. And the security team might be undersized or non-existent. So that really affects who is responsible for these things and how much is it a organizational objective. And that goes back to, is that even something that the organization is worried about? Is there a audit that needs to be passed? What kind of audit is it? What are the security requirements? So who is actually responsible is really going to affect that. But my estimate would be, I don't know how to number it, but it really is an afterthought for the vast majority of startups, unless it's a startup in the crypto space or a startup in the financial space that knows right off the bat that it's going to have a PCI DSS audit, for example.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
so that
how critical is your secret to get right if you're just gonna pull the rug out of a Ponzi scheme anyway? I mean, it's a time limited issue for the crypto bros.
Yeah. I mean, I'll throw some perspective out there as well, from previous companies. I always felt like, secrets, when it came to maintaining them in a daily fashion, it was like probably less than like 3% of our time actually caring about it and maintaining it. But then all of a sudden, like, oh, we need to get PCI compliance or we need to be HIPAA. And then it's like 50% of your time because you're going through and you have to spend so much time like backtracking through stuff that's been done, making sure you're compliant. So it's a little bit of give and take. I feel like it's rare in my experience that teams have dedicated resources and time on a weekly basis to focus on this stuff. And it's usually like more the house is on fire, let's figure out how to put it out situation, which is not good.
Think about it this way, though. The more time you have to spend on secrets probably means that you don't have a good system in place, right? If it's really like the ideal system and everything's automatic, it's supposedly it's going to require very little human interaction. However, that being said, it's not a thing that you build once and that's it. I think that, let's take Vault as an example, which I also want to talk about, is it even would I recommend Vault for like most startups? And I'll probably say no, because it's a lot of effort and you could probably just use the whatever cloud provider you're using. They all have secret services for secrets management, and they integrate rotation with like, for example, AWS Secrets Manager has automatic rotation integrated with RDS, and you can use AWS Lambda to have functions that rotate things that are not their services. So, but how much in Vault, for example, there's a lot of work that's going to be done aside from keeping the thing up and running and then upgrading and maintaining it. Say for they have like now the hosted solutions now, but a lot of work into actually managing the roles and to onboarding new providers and new teams to use certain roles. Like that's a constant effort, and that's probably where the energy would go. But in a place where there is no system, you're click opsing, like creating the secret, storing it in one password, doing that. So that could be counted towards the time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess let's just, talk about specifically a pattern that we've seen quite a bit. And Dan and I were kind of discussing this. So, we were talking about how we see people rotating secrets inside of CI pipelines quite frequently. Dan, what are your thoughts on that? Like, you think that's a good practice, bad practice? Depends on the situation.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I think that like perfect is the enemy of the good. And like if you've got CI/CD pipelines and you can rotate your secrets that way, sure is a hell of a lot better than not rotating them. So it's like, hey, if that's the easy tool at hand, grab it and go. And maybe you don't have, budget to pay for the big solution like Yoni was talking about. And in that case, using something like a CI/CD pipeline to rotate secrets, I think is perfectly acceptable. I think you want to make sure, you're going to take a little extra care with that pipeline and make sure that it's not going to have, limit access to it and that kind of stuff. But no, I think it's perfectly acceptable. I mean, anytime you're able to improve your process, don't hesitate, right? Just improve the process and you're going to come back to it, because it's not as simple as like, okay, I'm going to introduce this solution and it's done. You also have to think through the scenarios of like, well, how does this work in staging? How does this work in dev? Like, how does this work on a developer's machine? How are they going to be able to test it? There's scenarios where I've been working with CI/CD pipelines and I want to test them locally, but to test them requires secrets. And then it's like, okay, I need to have a way to test against dummy services. And then how much is that worth it? So, you get a diminishing point of return. So you have to think through the scenarios. But I think, as long as it's an improvement over what you're doing, sounds great. And honestly, like if you're using something like OIDC tokens for everything, then maybe you don't need it, but not everything supports that. So you're still going to have to support these legacy systems. Like, I don't know if Salesforce supports it, so you might still have to use a secret rotation if you have a service that's hitting Salesforce API or just any external API. Maybe it doesn't support it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's, Yoni, from your perspective, what do you think about the CI side of this? Like, are there some things that you just have to use a CI pipeline for, or, because you seem to lean heavily towards, you really like the OIDC approach, right? But can you always do that?
Yeah, I think sometimes the CI just ends up being the most logical place. I'll give you an example again without too many details, but we we do have um, a self-hosted runner environment and basically a hub sort of setup where this hub cluster. So these runners for the CI run on this hub cluster, and this hub cluster also has a lot of things that are used by the rest of the company, including things like the VPN solution that we're using, including things like just internal services that developers need for their day to day, and it just ends up being that it makes the most sense for something running in that environment to change secrets in that environment. And I guess you could also use AWS Lambda if you really wanted to rotate secrets in that environment. But then ultimately, some of those things end up going into Kubernetes anyway. So maybe you want something running on Kubernetes, changing these secrets on, and that is a being CI. So it's really dependent on the situation. But you should always look at, rather than, and this goes back to people still doing kubectl apply and Helm upgrade in their CI. It's take a look and ask yourself, is that really what I should be doing in 2023? What are other people doing? What is the best practice for it?
Right.
And definitely do your homework first. But I think it's perfectly fine in some cases that make sense for your organization in that specific situation to rotate secrets from CI. But if you're doing everything from CI, including deployments, including rotation, this I've seen this. Jenkins does everything. Jenkins now does Terraform applies now, even though there's better solutions for Terraform, like Spacelift or like what do you call it? The HashiCorp one, Terraform Cloud. Um, some people need to get away from using their CI as the one thing to rule everything, and to
Yeah.
find better solutions, including
Right.
secret rotation.
And it's finding a good balance there. So we got, we're getting close to the end here. So we're gonna do a couple lightning rounds on questions here. So we mentioned that culture is pretty important with this, right? Getting buy-in on sort of secrets baked into the process. Do you have any recommendations for how you'd handle that education about it internally, whether it's your secrets process or a secure pipeline, policy? How would you recommend kind of educating people, enforcing some of that internally?
Um, that's a really hard one. I've tried to create, and this not only secrets, this is also for general like shared services, central services kind of type of stuff that you're managing as a DevOps engineer. You're hoping that other people in the company can benefit from the stuff you're building, secrets management being one of them. And you don't want to be the victim of your own success, so to speak. So you're the only one that can do these things. So now every time somebody wants a new secret to be created or a new environment to be deployed, they're always coming to you. You do want some level of self-service in your organization. So this idea that you want to educate. So I've tried to at numerous companies to create little sessions, 1 hour sessions here and there, and teach people how to do this and how this works. And I don't think it's that successful. And I'm trying to think what is a better way. And I think ultimately is maybe a very pessimistic way to look at it, but it really comes from the top. If and how the organization is structured. If it's properly structured and people have the need, the incentive, the requirement that, hey, we have security requirements. And if because of your team, we're not passing that audit renewal at the end of the year, like they have an incentive to actually listen to you. So they will come to you. You don't have to chase them and create these webinars that people are half attentive and they're going to forget. And maybe you didn't even present and convey everything correctly. So, but I'm not saying those things are not valid. Definitely. And I'm not saying that Confluence pages that you're creating that people are there to read, they're not valid either. You should be doing that stuff, but it's not everything. I don't think that's even 50% of it. I think that's just a necessary thing you have to do. But it goes hand in hand with the responsibility of people to educate themselves. They need to actually come to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dan, you're somewhat of a master of creating educational content. So what's your position on this? I'm curious. Oh, you're muted.
I would definitely say have a concrete example that people can start building off of, especially because it's like I mentioned, there are so many scenarios to think about. And so if you have a concrete solution, you kind of need a pilot program where you do it in one project first, the right way or the improved way. And then you can start to say, hey, this is how it's working for us. This is why it's saving us time. This is why it's making us more secure. And, here's the template. You can start going with this. Then it starts to feel less like a project, like a research project, and more like an implementation chore. And that's actually good, that it's like, I know how to do it. We have a template for doing it. I see how it works in the different scenarios, and I'm going to be able to take advantage of it right away. That's probably the best thing I would say. And I think Yoni is dead on that, making sure that everybody agrees about the importance. Maybe nobody cares about the secrets, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we care, and that might.
I really like what you just said just now before about doing like a pilot thing, and it relates to some of my experience where I had my answer from is I've just been in a situation where I am going to educate people and give them this thing. And as I'm building out this pilot for the first time and figuring out, well, how are they going to use it? Like I'm putting into my presentation, into my session with them, I'm implementing it as I'm going. And it's not tried, right? I don't know if it works in my organization's culture. I don't know if it even works technically. I've never tried it with a team, and I'm expecting to give them this thing and expect them to first understand it. There's an assumption that I'm even conveying it correctly, and an assumption that it's even going to work. So I think a really good formula for making a change in your organization is actually just a theory, but get buy-in from like your VP of engineering or CTO that this is a problem. Ask them, is this a problem? He says, yes. If we don't do it, our customers are we're either not going to buy us because we don't have this security compliance, or they're going to leave us. So yeah, please do this. Actually, you have to do this, or I'm firing you. And you have buy-in, okay? And then you do like a pilot with the first team, and you work with the first team. You as a DevOps engineer, DevOps team are working with a development team, and you build out this kind of contract that you're maintaining this cloud environment, or you're maintaining Vault, and you're writing these policies, and they're using them, and it actually helps them get their job done, and they like it, and it's not cumbersome. Okay, and that's your pilot, and then from there you go to other teams, and you have that scale in your organization. That would probably be a 3-step formula that may or may not work.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Prove it and don't defer the pain until later. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but stick around for some Q&A here. We'll do a little bit of Q&A time. And then just to let you know, the next topic that we're talking about in emerging domain is about feature flags. So we're having Cody DeArkland on from Launch Darkly. That should be an interesting one. I'll post a link in chat. Dan, do you have a GitOps the Planet that you want to plug coming up here soon?
We have a whole nother string of GitOps the Planets coming, so stay tuned, and we'll be announcing the schedule soon. We've got a lot of cool people coming on, and a little different show, but very complimentary to what you're doing with Merging Domain.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm going to kick us into Q&A here with a little bit of music. Try to find something good. And then, actually, we do have a question here. So, and this was something we touched on a little bit, but there are so many secrets management solutions now, right? With every cloud provider having one. You have the enterprise ones like Vault, BeyondTrust, CyberArk, and, they were just asking, how do you select one? And I think you kind of touched on a little bit, Yoni, but it depends on your situation, right? Like if you need something that's on-prem, you manage yourself, it becomes very good to have something like Vault or BeyondTrust or CyberArk that can be installed as a on-prem solution, but you need to make sure that you're willing to do the care and feeding for it. And I think that is often overlooked. But if you're in the cloud and you have relatively simplistic needs, the cloud vendor solutions seem pretty good to me. One thing I will say that in my experience using something like BeyondTrust or CyberArk or even Vault Enterprise might have this feature, is they do allow you to have time-limited access to specific environments. So say you're having like a production outage, it can automatically go out and create a temporary token or access rights for you to access the production environment for like 10 minutes. And then it automatically logs and even like records the whole session. So you know exactly what happened. That's something that you're not going to get with like a pre-baked solution or even roll your own vault. That can be pretty nice. I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts on that, but kind of my perspective.
Yeah, those are definitely the features also that get those enterprise sales for those solutions, is any disaster recovery, break glass stuff, and temporary access in a highly compliant, highly secure enterprise organization. So yeah.
I think with Kubernetes, I would start with external secrets. To be very concrete, I think that's a really strong solution, and it works with multiple different external secret store backends if you want to work with a cloud provider or HashiCorp Vault or whatever. So I think I would start probably there for Kubernetes. For CI/CD, I think maybe cloud secret storage is probably the one I'd start with. If you're using like CodeFresh, it has a built-in secrets management that's pretty good for handling, especially static secrets. But that's probably where I would start, and
Yeah.
then look at
Yeah.
what options you have for OIDC if you can do it.
Right. Add the complexity when you need it, right? Which makes sense to me. Well, thank you so much for joining everyone today, and hopefully you found this a very valuable session. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. So you can definitely reach Dan on Twitter at
At today was awesome, but you'll have to
today
wait
was
till I
awesome.
wake up next week.
Yeah, next week when he's awake. Me at Techie Overtime. And yeah, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to have a discussion. Thank you, everyone.